for the publication in each other's collections of poetry. The Penang Press maintained connections, as I mentioned, across the Bay of Bengal, authors with their teachers, but also they did this by publishing articles, as I mentioned, from newspapers which were from other places like India, Ceylon newspapers, newspapers from Burma, and then the Penang and Singapore Press took their articles and published them again and took them as sources for events in South Asia and the Middle East. And conversely, the same thing happened, that newspapers in India and in Sri Lanka used Penang and Singapore as a source for news on Southeast Asia. So in one very important newspaper from Sri Lanka, Muslim Nesan, we find a Penang correspondence report regularly about the Aceh War, for example. And the evidence of letters and subscribers I've mentioned several times already. Now, sometimes these could lead to something that almost approached the flame wars of nowadays, because the readers could send their letters. They knew which newspaper would be read in their own town, right? They could send a letter to a newspaper in Sri Lanka, knowing that months later that newspaper would come back. And if their letter was published there, their letter could be read in their hometown. This was especially important since most of the times you had only one newspaper in your town. If you were not happy with the editor of that newspaper, you wanted to criticize him, chances were you send a letter and it was never published. But knowing that this other newspaper from Sri Lanka or from India was also read, you could send a letter there, and if that editor was willing to publish it because for some sort of enmity or just for business reasons, you could actually hope that you get some sort of reaction. Now, one of the most interesting things, and I haven't yet been able to really go into the details of this, was a sort of ongoing debate between the readers of Vidya Vicharini in Penang and the readers of a very important newspaper from Kandy in Sri Lanka, Muslim Nesan. And the editor of Vidya Vicharini was an important poet. The editor of Muslim Nesan was a very important Muslim reformer who was quite critical of Tamil poets at that time. And what happened was, it starts, this is the page on which it starts, in a sense. One Penang Muslim complains that he had sent a question to the editor of Muslim Nesan, and the only thing he got in reply was a sort of angry letter. So he published in Vidya Vicharini a complaint about this guy publishing this Muslim Nesan. Now, when it is suddenly in the Penang newspaper, the readers in Sri Lanka could see it, and the editor felt the Muslim Nesan editor felt compelled to answer. So he first has a short section where he says, I'm so happy that this Vidya Vicharini newspaper is published in Penang. And then he reproduces the letter and then gives an answer of, and then on the next page writes, well, actually, now I present to the public what the question was, and I think I don't have to say anything about the question, and you can see from yourself why I got angry. And the question actually is, what is the difference that Muslim Nesan has a male title? Nesan is a male word, whereas Vidya Vicharini has a female title. Right? Vicharini is a female word in Sanskrit. So, but then it goes on, and in the further issues of this Muslim Nesan, again and again, you find people writing letters from Penang directly to Muslim Nesan saying Vidya Vicharini is horrible. At the same time, in Vidya Vicharini, letters were published how bad Muslim Nesan was, and then the editor of Muslim Nesan replied to them. So this is what at least a little bit we have left of Vidya Vicharini. And the whole thing may have been a conflict between the editors. As I said, this MC Sidilawai, who edited Muslim Nesan, was rather critical of traditional Tamil poets, of whom Ghulam Qadir Nawala was a proponent. The last points that I have to refer to is this question of, were the Tamil newspapers in Southeast Asia diasporic? Very often this is the assumption that is made, that these newspapers were about India, right? But actually, when you look into the early newspapers, India plays a relatively minor role in the coverage. It's really all over the place. You get news from America to Australia. And India plays a part, but a relatively minor part. These were newspapers which were as concerned with local events, or as concerned with, you might say nowadays, global events, as they were with events in their home country. India becomes more important in the course of the early 20th century, usually, especially with the rise of the Indian national movement. But it doesn't really become the main topic of Indian newspapers or Tamil newspapers in Southeast Asia until after the First World War. And the reason for that, I feel, is that the British tended to react to coverage on India, whereas they ignored local coverage, they ignored if Islamic matters were covered, then these newspapers were not important. When the newspapers complained about how it was in Penang or in Singapore, the British didn't react. When they said the British are really unjust to India, then British newspapers tended to react. And thereby, Indian newspapers started to get the feel, well, the best thing is to publish stuff on India. At least we get into a sort of communication, we get noticed. But of course, this was also a development which in a sense pushed the Muslims out a little bit, because the Muslims were A, not particularly interested at that time in the national movement, and B, they could not represent that national movement very well. They were supposed to represent Muslim interests only. I have a feeling this plays a part in the going down of Muslim publishing, and this is connected to the thing that the Muslims actually liked reporting about, that was the Ottoman Empire. That was the preferred political entity of many Straits Settlements Muslims. There was a large news coverage of Ottoman events. There was a large, as we have seen in that list, support for Ottoman wars. There was contestation in Penang, Jnanacharyan, of whether to cover Ottoman topics or Indian nationalism. So you had this Muslim editor who apparently at that time may have been the owner of the press, and he publishes only about the Ottomans. Then a Hindu owner comes in, replaces the editor. The editor is still a Muslim, but suddenly Indian nationalism receives much more of a coverage. The British react to all this Ottomanism only with the start of World War I and the declaration of war against the Ottomans. But then they react very decisively and very quickly. I give you two examples. One is from the Penang Gazette, 17th November 1914, about the Janupakari Daily News. We understand that today the editor and printer of the Tamil paper, Janupakari Daily News, were arrested by the authorities in connection with the publication of a paragraph in its issue of the 5th instant dealing with the declaration of war against Turkey. Janupakari continued to publish for some time, and they actually reacted to this claim that they had been arrested, and they assured their readers that they were continuing, etc. But the whole atmosphere changed, and even more interesting, I find this letter written also to the Penang Gazette, 9th December 1914, an appeal to Mohammedans. Sir, will you please allow me a little space in your valuable paper to remind the committee of the Turkish War Relief Fund, that was the fund we have seen where the Saigon Muslims contributed to, which was organized during the Balkan War, that at present they have a golden opportunity to dispose of what public money they still have in their hands by subscribing to the Prince of Wales War Relief Fund as coming from the Mohammedan public. I hope that those concerned, one of whom is a Mohammedan Justice of Peace, will take up the matter at once and decide what steps they had best take. Yours, a friend. Doesn't sound particularly friendly, but you can see how the climate very suddenly had changed for Muslim editors of newspapers. So after World War I, role of Muslims in Tamil publishing in the Straits Settlements is greatly reduced. Penang and Singapore each have a weekly after in the early 1930s, still with a Muslim editor, but it never really picks up. There are very few publications, both on the literary side as well as I said, newspaper editors. And at that time, diasporic topics about India and especially Indian politics take the forefront in the newspapers. And that, of course, becomes very strong in the 1930s when you have that very juicy topic of, are you in support of the Congress or are you in support of the Dravidian movement, when different newspapers in Malaya take different stands. Muslims in this context were not able to establish their representativeness of speaking representatively for the community at large, neither for the Congress side nor for the Dravidian side. They were always asked to contribute Muslim topics, and both sides claimed the Muslims support us, the Muslims support the Congress, the Muslims support the self-respect movement, but they were only asked to publish on Muslim topics, really. And there was still a large debate whether Muslims actually were Tamils among the Muslims themselves. So let me very quickly sum up this. I've already taken far too much time. Is it justified to call this, given the relatively few number of publications, I still admit that, to talk of something like a Tamil print revolution in the Straits Settlements? I think it is something we can actually use, because these print products enabled people to engage with Penang and with their surroundings in new manners. There were new possibilities to engage the government. The government that earlier on had, in the early 19th century, had tried to work through capitans, through community representatives, had basically given that up. They didn't like any sort of public demonstrations of community belonging unless it was presented in the press. So the press was a new means to actually engage the government. It was a new means to communicate beyond the locality. This way, as you have seen, you have these connections between South India, Sri Lanka, the Straits Settlements. If you look at some of the later newspapers, you find letters and subscribers and offices as far east as Makassar in Sulawesi, as far north as Hanoi and places in Burma, and as far west as the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. So this is a huge area that was actually connected through these newspapers, and that earlier on could not have been connected in communication as well as it did with these new means of communication. And it gave new possibilities for forming identities, for discussing identities, with very interesting results that nowadays we wouldn't even think of. For example, that people actually wrote, "We are citizens or subjects of the Ottoman Empire." Right? A South Indian Muslim born in the British Empire, making his living in another part of the British Empire, but saying, "I'm actually a subject of the Ottoman Empire." And that was something that could be discussed in these newspapers, that could be elaborated. And people asked questions about that. One of the editors of Penang, Nyanacharyan, took the title Effendi. And at one point he got into a fight with a reader, that same reader who wrote about the Hajis, and that reader asked him, "Who gave you that title? This is an Ottoman noble title. Did the Ottomans supply you with that title? Why did you take it?" Right? So that was also something in which the Tamil press was, I think, quite important. But we have also to acknowledge there were limits. There was a limit of what Timothy Harper has called Timothy Harper has talked about the formation of public sphere in the Straits Settlements, where communities for the first time had to talk to each other. Now, unfortunately, what you also see is that many communities, and very strongly the British press and the English language press, refused to talk to something like the Tamil press, unless it was necessary. For example, when it concerned Indian nationalism, about which the government became increasingly wary. There were economic compulsions that that limited the expansion of these newspapers. And there was, in some instances, and increasingly also political pressure. So we have to take the limits of this press into account. But I still think it is a very fascinating source for our history, for the history of Penang, and for the history of the whole Bay of Bengal through these interlinkages. And with that, sorry for the long time I took, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Torsten, for the interesting and very informative lecture on the Tamil Muslim and the role they played, through publications or publishing. As we may know, the present situation in Penang or even in Malaysia, compared to what we heard from Dr. Torsten just now, there is a kind of alienation, between the Tamil Muslims and the Tamil language. Perhaps, these days we don't see that much of effort from Muslims in publishing these vernacular or Tamil papers or books. We have very few, not to say none. But for instance, like Naina Muhammad, I don't know where he is here or not. He has been publishing a magazine, a monthly, for the last so many years, Nam Kural. Though he is facing so much of financial difficulty, as Dr. Torsten said just now, he also keeps writing in his monthly that so many people are still owing so much of money, they're not paying on time. So he has difficulty in continuing the publishing. So sometimes, certain months you won't get it. He's a good friend of mine. So it has been, like that then and also today. So that is one of the reasons, perhaps not many Muslims are coming forward to publish in Tamil. But the other problem here in Malaysia especially is the mother tongue of most of the Indian Muslims or Tamil Muslims is changing now. Many of them, are not that fluent, I would say, in Tamil, or they would not want to, continue to have Tamil as their language. I don't know, perhaps if they're talking that at home, but outside, generally we see that. And there's also a concern among many Tamil Muslims, especially in Penang, about Tamils, and they initiated some classes some times ago to teach Tamil. I don't know whether it still continues or not. So I hope, I wish that more Tamil Muslims are here, they should have seen the contributions of the Tamil Muslims, for the Tamil language, and they are the pioneers. Back in India, back in Tamil Nadu, we have, I would say, giants. They're fantastic people like Kaviko, Abdul Rahman, Mehta, or the late, M.M. Ismail. Several others, who are, we can consider as, authorities in Tamil. Even, Naina Muhammad, of Penang, is, some kind of authority in Tamil literature, Tamil grammar. I myself, consult him for Tamil, grammar. But the number is dwindling and decreasing. I don't know, what is, whether there's a future for Tamil among the Tamil Muslims in Malaysia as a whole. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Torsten. I don't know, perhaps, yesterday when your paper was in Tamil, there might have been, more Tamil Muslims there. Perhaps it would have, it will encourage them to, start talking in Tamil and accepting Tamil as their mother tongue, and perhaps, contribute again for Tamil language. And perhaps, involved in, we have a Tamil paper, Malaysian Nanban is actually, the proprietor is a Tamil Muslim. The other papers, no, only Tamil, Malaysian Nanban at the moment. Well, thank you once again. And now I open the floor for questions. If you have any comments or you need some clarifications, please come forward, introduce yourself, and ask Dr. Torsten is willing to explain and enlighten you. Thank you.
I just want to know the collection, the relief fund, it seems to a very big amount. Those days, we leave about 10 cents, 20 cents, we can leave a day of makan and all. How come they put like that, and is that the real figure, or I just want to know how it's...
I wished I could say whether it was the real figure. I suspect that the actual figure was lower. I suspect really that much of this was pledge, and it was never sent. At the same time, the thing is, there were people who could have afforded this. And there are instances when you can actually say that a list of contributors must have really contributed about the amount of money that is given. For example, in 1887, a group of largely Indian Muslims in Singapore got together, and they collected money for buying a crystal chandelier, which was then sent to Nagaur. And the event was reported, so that chandelier was really really bought. And they give a list of the donors, and The interesting thing is that the highest of the Muslim donors for that chandelier was a very important gem merchant at that time. So he obviously could spend something like, I think he had given $150 or $200, which in the 1880s was even more than at that time. Though the largest contribution to that, interestingly, came from the Katz brothers. So there were apparently quite a lot of Tamil Muslims working with them, and they had apparently approached them. So they gave the largest contribution, but there were people in the community who could afford sums like that. Now, how much they actually got, I don't know, but at least the British suspected, as you could see from that newsletter, that there was something there. And maybe the last information on this, if you actually then look in the later First World War, this Prince of Wales Relief Fund continued for a fairly long time. And repeatedly you find such lists also in the English newspapers. And there are again and again lists where there are quite a number of Muslim names and some obviously South Indian Muslim names. And a parallel to this maybe, in the late years of the First World War, there was, of course, also a large number who had come from Karaikal and surrounding villages. Now, these were officially French subjects, and they formed a fund for or contributed to the French War Relief Fund. And that was published in the Straits Times, and that was a substantial collection as well, the top of which was Kader Sultan from Singapore, the cattle trader, who later on got an honor from the French government for his efforts during the war to support the French government. So there were people in the community. The amount you see there is not, it's not unbelievable. I don't think that all of it actually reached further than Penang, but one never knows. I mean, it's not quite clear how much of that really was there, but it's not completely out of tune with what some of the richer families actually could provide. I have no clue. There are three possibilities. Possibility number one, in this case, I didn't photocopy the article. I copied it myself. I may have made a copying mistake. Possibility number two, very often you have printing mistakes. So it may be something else. One of the letters has to be changed and maybe you get the right thing. Possibility number three is there were quite a lot of words, and there are quite a lot of words in these newspapers that you don't find in the dictionary. There are words borrowed from Malay, there are words even borrowed from Chinese, and some of the poets actually excelled in this. They write in the preface, this poem is written using all sorts of words from Chinese, Urdu, Malay, and so on and so forth, and you find that. You even find Malay poems printed in Tamil script. It's at least one case that I'm aware of. So I'm not really sure. I suspect it's a printing mistake. It could be a copyist mistake. I might have made a mistake copying it.
Any more questions?
Hi. I got a few questions actually. Just to clarify on the Tamil term, does it, in your lecture, in this context, does it just specifically refer to the Southern Indian only? And if it's yes, I'd like to know, just to go a little bit out of that context, I see Tamil as Indian and as a whole, and like in the Strait settlement in Penang or in Singapore, does the Northern Indian community, do they play a role in the Tamil printing? And then the other thing is, you were saying that some of the publisher, their story leans toward the Ottoman news. So does it has to do with the connection because it's focused on the Muslim community? And one more last one. Is there any possibilities during that time, being that is during a colonization period, is there like any individual society or perhaps like how do you call it, secret society that funds all these newspapers to promote their own propaganda in their publishing? Thank you.
Okay. As for the term Tamil, of course, is the language which is spoken, so to say, if you want to say, historically as a native language in southeastern India and in parts of Sri Lanka. And of course, you had a long, long history of connection of that region with Southeast Asia. And there have probably been for centuries Tamil-speaking pockets of Tamil-speaking communities, traders, etc., living in Southeast Asia. And this, of course, went up during the colonial period. There were more people coming. But there's one important thing which I think nowadays is not often appreciated. This is the language Tamil. Nowadays we have the feeling that everyone who speaks a certain language belongs to the people by the same name. So we think, okay, there's Tamil as a language. Does that mean there was a Tamil people? And that is a much more complicated question. Actually, when you look at many of these newspapers, they use the word Tamilar, which means something like, nowadays one would use it as the Tamil people, Tamils. They use it to refer to a specific group of castes. And the Muslims are not called Tamilar. The lower castes are not called Tamilar. I have an example where even the Chettiars are not called Tamilar. So that needs to be slightly distinguished. And this is one of the reasons why then in the 1930s there was a lot of discussion. Are Muslims Tamils? Nowadays in India, at least, this would sound like a strange question. They speak Tamil, they are Tamils. But even to this day in Sri Lanka, the Muslims of Sri Lanka by and large speak Tamil at home. But they don't identify as Tamil. They are not counted as Tamil in the census. And this is a very interesting thing. When you look at the 4 countries where Tamils have a certain presence, India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore. In India, as well as in Singapore, Muslims tend to be very clear that they are Tamils when they speak Tamil. In Malaysia and in Sri Lanka, the situation is different. And I think this, by and large, has historical reasons connected to the post-independence history of each of these countries. Political reasons, reasons why in some way areas they split, in other areas they came together. Yet at the same time, in the area of language, I think they all contribute together. There are people like Numan from Sri Lanka, who is a commentator on Tamil literature, who is a very respected person in the Tamil literary community, etc. Right? So there are these connections to the language, but in how far Muslims are Tamils or not, that was actually a point of debate at that time. So number one. The participation of North Indians in the Tamil language press, I've seen very, very little. I can't say it's completely absent. I've seen 1 or 2 cases in this list of subscribers to Single Nason who seem to be Gujaratis from their name. But that is in the very, very early period. Later on, I haven't really come across North Indians playing a role in the Tamil language press. Usually the elites among the North Indians, there was a lively Indian English press, and they participated in that. There were some attempts in the 1930s to found Gujarati newspapers. There was one attempt to found a Hindi newspaper, one attempt to found an Urdu newspaper. But it seems that these did not take off very well, because the number of people who would have been there who would have read these newspapers doesn't seem to have been very great. So that was the second. The third one was, or the fourth one I think was about that, whether there was somebody behind this newspaper. Like, I have not found anything, and given the fact that these editors like to spit poison at each other, I don't have the feeling that there's one power behind them all. So there were supporters, and some of the editors would say, our friends now are very strong, and where are all these guys who have tried to start newspapers? We are still publishing, but I can't see your newspapers, right? So I don't think that there was anyone behind them. But for the colonial situation, there was one, perhaps one thing one should mention. The newspapers in Malaya have often been considered to be rather tame, especially when you consider them with newspapers in India, where these were really a very important agent for nationalist mobilization. But the interesting thing that I found is that you do find cases where, through the back door, the government is actually criticized. First of all, the British Empire is actually quite brazenly criticized. Not the local British government, but the actions of the British, for example, in Sudan, are very, very openly criticized. And another thing that happens is, for example, when the Muslim marriage bill was discussed in the Strait settlements, suddenly you'll find a number of articles about what the Muslims in Sri Lanka thought about their marriage bill and how they were opposed to it. They don't mention the Strait settlements, but you get a feeling these articles were published with a reason, to basically say we are not really happy with what is discussed as a Muslim marriage bill here in the Strait settlements. Now there's one question of yours which I had forgotten. Okay, yeah, that is obviously the link. That is obviously the link. And this was clearly seen by everyone. So the editor of Singay Nasan, for example, on his first page, first issue in 1887, you have a long English glorification of Queen Victoria. And then behind it, everyone has noted that because it's in English, it's very easy to read. Just behind that is a glorification of the Ottoman Sultan. And that actually says, that calls Istanbul, the city of Istanbul, the capital of all Muslims. Now, this idea that it was Istanbul and not Mecca or some other place, that is the capital of all Muslims,